Okay. Thank you, Wayne. And it's good. Good evening, first of all. It's good to be here with all of you. Oh, I can't see them, but I remember what you look like. Um, you know, the last time I spent any time at the Bright School was over 65 years ago. Um, and I want to thank all of you who were here. You braved some kind of weather out there. And I want to thank the people who are watching on Zoom, with special thanks to the Waltham Historical Society for inviting me to present. It seems that we often become our own family historians. Everyone else has passed, and we become the keepers of the photos, the documents, and the stories. But how do we ensure that the stories of our family roots and experiences will be available to future generations? Well, you can go through the pictures and you can annotate them, which really is a help for anyone who's coming along after you. You can do that in your albums that you might have too. You can certainly digitize photos and look at any videotapes you and have them converted to some kind of a technology that you'll be able to actually see, because try to get a VCR these days. There just aren't any. Or you could have an audio recording of your family stories, or you could write a book. And you could certainly write it in longhand. And there are many authors who write in longhand. Think about Stephen King and some other authors. And there's something very special about writing on, with pen or pencil, and something about the thoughts coming down the arm and writing on the page. Or you could write on a computer and you could print it, or you could do as I did and find a way to publish it. Now, now I'm going to go to the next slide. You may not think that's a big deal, but for me it is. So tonight, I'm going to share the journey that I took in writing this book. And I'll start with the Waltham story, but really this journey began with a story a long time ago that my mother told me. But for 7 years, I've really been somewhat at it after I retired from education. And during the pandemic was when the majority of the writing and the research was completed. So I'm going to talk about the Waltham story, then I'm going to talk about the Athenry story, and then there's a return to Waltham. And finally, I'm going to talk about the process I went through in writing this book. So let's get acquainted. So I wonder how many of you who were here, and you might raise your hand if you wanted to, and I hope I can sort of see you. How many grew up in Waltham in the 50s and 60s? If you did, raise your hand. I see 2, 3, okay, and I did. And my sisters and I living in Waltham, and I'm sure that if you grew up in Waltham, you realize we could walk everywhere. We walked to Moody Street, to the 5 and 10. We walked to Main Street, to the Waltham Public Library. And from where we lived, we oftentimes walked down River Street to the Penny Pool, which became the Nickel Pool, and spent many happy summer days there. So how many of you attended the old Waltham High School on School Street? Who went to Waltham High School? 1, 2, 3 of us, huh? Okay. And you know what I was thinking too, that people who are home, you might want to put this in chat. You might want to just chat with each other and just put an answer in there, and maybe even what year you graduated. That might be interesting for people, and some people might connect that way too. And you know who else? I was the class of 1965 at Waltham High School, and it was a wonderful class. And you know who else was in the class of 1965? Marie Daly and Sheila Fitzpatrick, 2 of your dedicated officers here at the Waltham Historical Society. Now we get narrowing down. How many people here went to the Bright School? 1, 2, 2. Okay. And I went to the Bright School. I was here in kindergarten, and then I in second grade. And I had the, the wood wainscoting and it's an amazing feeling. So although I grew up in Waltham, and I was in Waltham until I went away to college, I have been in education for over 40 years. I was, as Wayne said, an English teacher. I was also a principal and administrator in Hudson. And as you probably know, there are many people who moved from Waltham to Hudson. And I didn't know that initially, but I just kept running into people from Waltham, um, who were in Hudson. And I started teaching at Hudson High School, and the colors were red and white. I kept thinking, Waltham High School, red and white. And the mascot was the same, the hawk. So it was as though I went from Waltham High School, I went off to college, and then came back and went to Hudson High School. Of course, I was a teacher then. And so later, many years later, I heard Hudson referred to as Waltham West. And that really made a lot of sense to me. And I'm sure you must know some people too who were there. So, okay. So I decided to call my book a family history novel. I think I made up that term. Now, I could have called it an historical novel, but that just didn't seem to fit as well, because what I had taken was a family story, and then I researched it, and then I added historical knowledge from the time, and then I added imagination so that would be the novel part. So that's why I called it a family history novel. So each of the people here has a complimentary 5x7 copy. And I wrote this book. I had a specific audience, family and friends. So tonight you're all my friends. And if people, I'll leave some books. If there are people who couldn't get here, you can certainly pick up a copy. I also have some copies that say slightly enlarged edition, a 6x8 book. And so people in those you could get on Amazon. It's Kindle Direct Publishing, and then there's also on Kindle for $2.99. But again, I'm not trying to sell books. I'm trying to share a process. Takes two clicks. Come on, baby. We'll go to the next slide. Oh, it just didn't like where I was getting it. Okay, so here we are at the Jonathan Bright School. And this is a picture from the 1920s, thanks to Wayne McCarthy and the Historical Society for this picture. And it's just so fitting that we are here and that the Waltham Historical Society is here, because the book I wrote starts right here at the Bright School. Because I went to the Bright School, but also my father, Martin, went to the Bright School. And it begins the last day of school, last day of classes in June 1929. And it begins with students lined up outside, eager to leave and to be able to begin their summer vacation. So we begin with a story. It doesn't everything. And my mother told me a story. My mother told stories all the time. Wherever she was, whether she was hanging up clothes on the line, even in the winter when they would freeze, she would tell us, we'd be with her, handing her clothespins, and she would tell us stories. So she told me about my father's family, the Hansberrys, how they sold their home on Hardy Street and moved to Athenry. My grandfather had inherited the family farm there. Then, because of an incident that my father encountered at school, the family moved back to Waltham, bought back their same house on Hardy Street, lived here for many years. And I heard this story many times, and I always thought it was remarkable. And as an adult, I asked my father, and although he didn't elaborate, he did say that it happened. And then one of my Aunt Mary Sarah said, yeah, but we were always going to come back. And that sort of spoiled the story that my mother had told me. So here's a picture of my father, Martin, probably about 7 years old, a school picture, I assume, at the Bright School. He's got a shirt and a tie. He was very good in classes. He loved school, but he also loved play. And so the next picture has my father, and then his brother, John, and then John Walsh. And the three of them probably in play clothes, and looks as if they were interrupted as they were eating apples. Someone asked them to pose, and so there they are. So, so let's go back to what Martin was doing on that last day of school. He was lined up with his fellow classmates, and although he loved school and did well, he couldn't wait for summer vacation to start. So here we are. Now, this 1918 map was Dana Hamlin, archivist at the Waltham Public Library, supplied this map. And so where we are right now, we're like up in the left-hand corner. The Jonathan Bright School is just off the map up there. And so you see Bright Street coming down all the way down to where it runs into River Street. And just to get, sort of your bearings on this, right about in the middle is a triangle, and it's Hardy and Hager Street. And there are three plots of land there. And to the side, it says Timothy Hansberry. So those are the three plots of land that my grandfather owned. So this is the house where I grew up, and also where my father grew up. And this would be the house where that day in June, he would have raced home to begin summer vacation. And this would be the house where his mother gave him some news. And the news was that the family was going to Athenry. Now, he knew his father had already gone to Athenry, but his mother, and that's my grandmother Margaret, said to her son, "We're going for a visit to Athenry." Well, that wasn't the whole story, because they were selling the house and moving to Athenry, where my grandfather Timothy had inherited the farm. So Martin consoled himself with the fact that he'd be back for third grade at the Bright School, and that was what he thought. He thought they were going for a visit. So here are Timothy and Margaret Hansberry and baby Mary Sarah. This is 1916. Now, they're not living in Waltham yet. They're living in Lynn at this point. However, they already have the house at 2224 Hardy Street. And so although they were living there, I just have to make, so in Lynn, Timothy owned or managed. I haven't been able to find that, but when he came over from Ireland, they came over to find work. So they didn't have money, but Timothy had done quite well. And in owning or managing one of the other three different bars in Lynn, he had done quite well for himself. But his wife, Margaret, wasn't very enamored of alcohol. And meanwhile, prohibition was prohibition. It didn't mean that drinking wasn't going on, but everything was a lot more complicated. So he was ready to leave Lynn. And it was 1916 where they acquired, and actually it was in Timothy's name, acquired the house. So what was really interesting was that I always thought my grandfather had built the house at 2224 Hardy Street. But as I researched it, I realized that the house was built even before my grandfather came over from Ireland. So that would have been quite a feat. So that didn't fit. When my mother died in 2014, I became the custodian of something that was in one of these envelopes like this, and it said these are the papers for 2224 Hardy Street. In here, I found a deed, and it was the estate of Francis Buttrick to Timothy Hansberry in May, and this is 1916. And the deed said, "In consideration of the sum of $1 and other valuable considerations to us paid by Timothy Hansberry of said Waltham." So this was rather amazing to me. I couldn't understand how my grandfather, how would he have known? Did he know of Francis Buttrick, or did he know someone who was managing the estate of Francis Buttrick. Couldn't find a connection. So that's when I went to the Waltham Historical Society and they did research. And Wayne and the people who looked for me, I mean, there's plenty of information on Francis Buttrick, but there wasn't anything about my father, my grandfather, and so Wayne referred me to Dana Hamlin, who's the archivist. Now remember, this is all during the pandemic, so we're doing all of this by email. And Dana, the way Wayne and the Historical Society was so helpful, and so was Dana Hamlin. And what she sent me was Buttrick's will. But first, let's talk a little bit about Francis Buttrick. And I'm thinking that most of you know about Francis Buttrick because he was a Waltham businessman and benefactor. Now, although he didn't grow up in Waltham, he wasn't born here. 1938, he was a Waltham-based carpenter. He must have been a wonderful carpenter because somehow, in less than, it was 19 years later, this carpenter was able to buy a lumber yard. And then I think Francis Buttrick was really good in running a lumber yard because at the same time he was in, not just dabbling in real estate, but buying lots and lots of real estate in Waltham. And so he made a fortune. Now, when he passed, he in his will, he gave money to Waltham. He gave $10,000 to the Unitarian Foundation. He gave, and we know that he gave $60,000 for a new library building. Now, it's not as if Waltham didn't already have a library. It did, but this was for a new building, the one that we're all accustomed to up on Main Street. Now, for some reason, who knows, all the lawyers involved or something, but legal issues prevented the use of that money. So by the time that the money was available to be used, that was 1914, that $60,000 had doubled to even more than that, $123,731 from interest. So we would say, from Waltham, thank you very much, Francis Buttrick. And I still just couldn't figure out how did this happen that my grandfather only paid $1, but in other valuable considerations. So went the wrong way, huh? Go this way. Nope. So we have to be patient because it's the one thing I didn't want to happen, but these things happen. Okay, here's the will that Dana Hamlin sent me, and so I read it, and it's very readable. Now, the only opening that I could find was that Buttrick also left $10,000 to the silent and deserving poor of Waltham. And how magnanimous that was of him. And I thought, could my grandfather and grandmother have been in that group of the deserving poor? Looking at the pictures of them and looking at their clothes, it just didn't seem that could possibly be. Dana Hamlin did an exhaustive search, looking through all kinds of lists, and gave me a lot of different documents, but there was no mention of Timothy Hansberry at all. So then I went back to the Waltham Historical Society and told Wayne and the other people there what I had found out, but I still had this question: how could it be? And there are 3 lots there. How could it be for $1? And I had no idea what could the other valuable considerations be. And the answer that was found from the Waltham Historical Society was it came from the Middlesex Registry of Deeds, where Wayne found a mortgage of $4,000 on the property. Now, the $1 plus valuable considerations made a lot more sense now. So these are the primary documents that I found. First of all, I found the deed of the sale of 2224 Hardy Street in 1929 from Timothy Hansberry to Thomas and Margaret L. Kane. Then I found the deed of the sale of 2224 Hardy Street in 1930, 1 year later, from Thomas and Margaret Kane to Timothy Hansberry. Now, I read them very carefully, and there was no language in the original, the 1929 deed, anticipatory of that it was just rented or that there would be a buyback. There's nothing like that. Each document, each sale is it's on its own. It's separate. And then I also found the power of attorney from Timothy to Margaret in Ireland, because when my grandmother Margaret tried to transact, remember, Timothy's already over in Athenry, so she's trying to transact this sale to the Kanes, but they won't let her because it's in Timothy's name. So she has to write to him. There's no cell phones, there's no phones to call that quickly. And so Timothy goes to a attorney, but they don't have attorneys in Ireland, a solicitor, and gets power of attorney and gets it back to her. And this delays the whole trip of the rest of the family to go to Athenry. So here are the Hansberry children, Mary Sarah. She's the oldest in the middle. My father's maybe two and a half there, the little one, and John. But the picture to the right is closer to the time when they did travel in 1929 to Athenry. And I think that probably the way my father is dressed, it looks as though it would be around, maybe he had just made his first communion. So I know that once everything was set for the sale, that Margaret and the three children traveled to Ireland on the ocean liner, the RMS Samaria, in August 1929. I have a documentation on that, but I have nothing else. So this is one of those parts where the book becomes a novel, and I made up what I thought might have happened on the trip. And I think that was almost more fun. So when we're writing about our families, or just even in general, but gather firsthand information first, and then ask questions. And that's Doris Kearns Goodwin, who knows just a little bit about being a historian and a historical novelist. And so I had done that. I had gathered the family photos and the legal documents, and I had my mother's story as a framework. I had questions. Now, one of them had been answered through research. I understood how the family and how Timothy and Margaret got the house, but I just still didn't understand why they sold the house, moved to Athenry, and then came back again within 1 year. So now I'm going to go to Ireland, and I'm wondering how many of you might have Irish roots or relatives, and people can put it in the chat if they want to. If you have Irish, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, most of us have some. And on St. Patrick's Day, we're all Irish. We know that. How many of you have visited Ireland? And if you haven't yet, 1, 2, 3, 4. So you have to go. If you are Irish and you haven't visited yet, wait till we get all the pandemic stuff and all the COVID over, and the world gets back to normal, and go to Ireland. And how many of you are familiar with Athenry? Not the song, The Fields of Athenry, but Athenry, the town. Okay, all right. So, all right. How many of you are familiar with the song, The Fields of Athenry? Most of you, yeah. This would be where we would play the song if we had it. So if you know it, it can be playing in your head. Did you know it was written in 1979 by Pete St. John? Even though it's set in the 1840s, the time of the Irish famine. That's really what it's about. So in the book, I've included quite a bit especially about the early days, the Irish history, the beginnings of Irish independence. And so this map, and this is just some of the west coast of Ireland. And so if you look right about in the middle at the bottom, and if you look at the airplane, it's the bottom airplane icon. And then you go to the left of that, and that's Galway City. And just to figure out where Athenry is from there, 16 miles inland or east to the right is Athenry, and that's where Athenry is located. So here's a little map of Athenry. It was founded in the 13th century during the Anglo-Norman invasions. Over 70% of the medieval town wall still stands. It's among the best preserved walled towns in all of Ireland. So that's part of its claim to fame. It's only about 40 square miles, and today's population is just over 4,000. In the decades after the Great Famine, there were so many young Irish who there was just no work for them, and so they came to the United States. And that was in the late 1890s into the early 1900s, when Margaret and Timothy left for the United States to find work. And they really met over here. They knew each other over there, but they met here and fell in love. So if you look at this map, right about in the center is something called the Market Cross. And that's going to play a part a little while later. And it's one of the oldest in Ireland. And then you see up in the upper right-hand corner, the castle. And right today, there's the Athenry Historical Society is located there. And then down from there, the priory, that would be where my uncle went to school. It doesn't show the place where my father went to school, but I think it would be even further down in the corner. And I'll talk a little bit about the school he went to. So while it was pretty easy for me to write about Waltham, because in many ways I am Waltham. People have asked me before, said, what kind of an accent do you have? And if there is such a thing as a Waltham accent, and I believe there is, I have it, and I like it. So it was easy for me to write about Waltham, but not so easy to write about Ireland. I had been to Ireland in 2006. Boston College sent me to Ireland, and with the principal I was working with in Hudson, and we were talking about social and emotional learning, and we were in Belfast. Now, I hadn't really wanted to go to Northern Ireland. However, that's where this cross-border conference was, and it was sponsored by the Teachers Union in Ulster and also by the teachers unions in the Republic. And so that was the kind of thing. How do you say no to something like that? So there were 10 days presenting at a big conference, and then talking at schools in Northern Ireland and in Belfast, and then in Dublin. There was no time to go to Athenry at that point, and I was happy to be there for Boston College, and so I couldn't steal away to the other coast at that point. But in 2009, I was presenting at the University of Galway, and I made sure this time that we had enough time to go to Athenry. So my husband Peter was there, and our nephew Martin was in Europe and met us there. And so we went to Athenry. Now, all I wanted was to find something, anything about our family in Athenry. And when we got there, we went over the little bridge, and the first building we saw on the left was this picture, this building, Hansberry's fully licensed accommodations. And Martin and I were really excited. Couldn't believe it. My husband Peter said to us, "You do realize that says Hansberry's, not Hansberry." That didn't matter at all to Martin and to me. This was it. Now, we went around the building trying to find any way to get into the building, couldn't get in. Nothing was open. There were no signs of life. Across the street, there was a little mini mart. So we went over to the mini mart, and we're still pretty excited. And there's a young man at the mini mart, and we tell him, we ask him, "Is it opened?" And he said, "Well, there's a woman, Catherine Hansberry, and she opens it sometimes in the afternoon for tea and sometimes for supper. You never know when it's going to be open. Sometimes it's open. Most of the time it's not open." And he said it hasn't been open for a number of days. So we thought, oh, great, nothing's going to come of this. So we told him our story and our name, and his ears perked up. And he said, "Do you know what? My best friend, Tom Barrett, his mother is a Hansberry." He says, "I'm going to call Tom." So he called Tom, and he arranged for us to meet Tom in the Athenry Square, right in the middle where that the cross is. And, you know, Tom's coming right out. Tom worked at the Athenry Heritage Center as a guide at that point. So we went up and all excited to talk to my husband. And he said, he wasn't as excited as we were. He said, doesn't it sound, you know, like a scam, a tourist scam? But for Martin and for me, you know, this was it. We were going to meet somebody who was perhaps related. And so Peter said, okay, we'll go down there and I'll stand off at distance and kind of surveil this whole thing, make sure that everything looks okay. So that's a good compromise. So off we went. It was a short distance. And this is the cross, the market cross. And at the very top, it depicts the crucifixion, and these market crosses from like the 13th century, they're not in the shape of a cross, you know, it's square. Well, that's where we met Tom Barrett, who was a very engaging, personable, warm young man who, as I said, worked as a tour guide at the Heritage Center and gave us a great tour. Now that's beside is a picture of St. Mary's Church, and you see some of the graveyard there. So now, one thing I did know about the family was that Timothy's younger brother, Martin, was considered one of the 12 apostles of Athenry. And this picture that they have of the 12 apostles is from 2016, and when there was a centennial there. Now, unfortunately, there's no picture, there's no photograph of Martin. So he's one of the ones, they just have the drawing, the outline, and you have the pictures of some of them young and some of them a lot older who were still alive at that point. So this is the one thing that I knew. I knew about, and I had read documentation on Martin, and that these 12 were part of the 1916, the Irish Easter uprising. And fortunately for them, they didn't meet the fate that people did in Dublin. And what happened to some of the people who were, it was men, captured in Dublin, that they were executed, you know, very quickly. These 12 were sentenced. They did go to Dublin, but they were sentenced to hard labor in prisons in England, Wormswood Prison, another prison, and all the documentation is there. Now, unfortunately for my great uncle, he came back. He withstood all that and came back and was out with a friend hunting, and somehow one of the guns went off, hit him in the leg, and he lost so much blood that he died. And his funeral cortege they talked about was over a mile long. So they're considered the 12 apostles of Athenry. So here's a picture of the row houses and the shops in Athenry in the 1920s. So again, remembering that Margaret and the children weren't able to meet Timothy there until August. And Martin was starting to realize this is going to be a really long visit because he had to start school in Ireland. So while his brother and sister went to schools taught by nuns, he went to the Athenry boys' school. And he, remember, you know, he got a good education here at the Bright School. And he found that he was way ahead of the other boys. And in fact, the schoolmaster, there were no nuns there, but the schoolmaster seemed to imbibe more liquids than solids at lunchtime. And so while some teaching went on in the morning, in the afternoon, not much learning went on. And the schoolmaster, his head would often nod down, and he would be asleep. So Martin came up with his own plan. What he would do is go down to the basement where I guess it was like a single toilet or maybe two, and there was a chair there, and there was a window, and he would stand on the chair, and he would open the window, and he would slither out the window, and then make it look as though it were closed, and then he would scurry over into the town where he had met many of the shopkeepers, and he helped them. He worked in different shops. And when they asked him about school, wasn't he missing school? He assured them that he wasn't missing any school. He had done all his work. And so, and this went on for a while. It's a picture of the Athenry Boys School. I have another picture that I brought. It's of 1929, but as many times as I've looked at it, I can't see my father in it. But this is kind of what the boys look like. Some of them look a lot older than the other boys. Um, so so once the teacher's head falls down and Martin does that, he's off, and then when he hears the students coming back, thronging the boys, they would make a lot of noises. They were leaving school and coming through the little square in the town. Then he would join them and he would go home. And nobody seemed to care that he did this. Now, there are letters and cards from Mary Sarah to John. Mary Sarah and John mailed back from Athenry to their friends, Mary and Robert Casey, who lived on Bright Street. I mean, I can believe all the Bright Street connections that there are in this story, but that's where they lived. Now, I have these. I even have the envelopes. I brought a few of them. The envelope showing that they had come back here from Ireland. I'm thinking, okay, how do I have them? Then I figured out, I mean, my Aunt Mary Sarah was friends with Mary Casey, and I'm thinking that once the Casey family, as people passed, these came back to Mary Sarah, they went to my mother, and then they were in that envelope that I had. What's wonderful about these is you hear, you see the penmanship. Of course, they could all write with beautiful cursive. As an English teacher, I look at my aunt and my uncles, some of the grammar, and I say, I wince a little bit at that. But their voices, their young voices come right through, and they describe what life was like. And so that was invaluable information for me to have. I mean, talk about firsthand information. So back to the story. Not yet. Now we're going to read a little bit, but you know what? Let's see if I can see by the light. So remember that Martin has been skipping out of school, and nobody knows. Well, okay, this is a few weeks later. Timothy waited until after dinner when he and Martin were by themselves in the dining room. Martin, I need to have a talk with you now. Martin turned to his father with interest. He was always glad to have time alone with his father, so he looked forward to their conversation. Martin, this is a serious talk. You need to be able to see, to be sure to tell me the truth. Martin was surprised by the gravity of Timothy's voice. He promised his father that he would tell the truth. Timothy looked increasingly constrained. He cleared his throat a few times. Now, Martin, you have been seen in the graveyard during the hours you should have been in school. Tell me the truth, son. Were you in the graveyard today? Martin figured he could answer that question truthfully. He knew the graveyard near St. Mary's Church on the other side of the square. Martin had not been anywhere near the graveyard today or any other day. Martin said, Pa, I haven't been near the graveyard. With that, Timothy sighed heavily. His face grew increasingly flushed, and he added, Martin, more than one person, and I trust all the people who told me, more than one person has told me with certainty that you were in the graveyard. I am so disappointed in you. Timothy told Martin to turn around. His father gave him 3 hard whacks on his bottom. It was the first and the last time that Timothy ever spanked his son. Martin was humiliated. He tried desperately not to let the tears of dismay and stinging pain start to fall. When Timothy saw the anguish on Martin's face, he was filled with concern and even some remorse. He brought Martin to sit beside him. Martin, let's go through this together. When you were supposed to be in school in the afternoon, you were seen outside the school basement in the graveyard. Are you telling me that you haven't been skipping school and playing truant? Martin's eyes widened. He realized that his father was talking about a different graveyard than Martin. He had answered Timothy's question in regard to the church graveyard. Martin knew he was telling the truth about that graveyard, but he also knew that he had been skipping school. In that respect, he had misled his beloved father. I knew about only one graveyard in town, the cemetery near St. Mary's. Martin explained to his father that no, there was another graveyard and he didn't mean to lie. He also admitted that he deserved the spanking because he had been leaving school. And so he tells his father, "Hi, every day the schoolmaster falls asleep in the afternoon. We don't learn anything. I'm skipping a little. He isn't even a good teacher." His father was looking closely at his young son. Martin knew his father was hearing him. "I want to go back to the bright school where I was learning every day. I'm not learning anything here. I go into town each afternoon. I help the shopkeepers. None of them ever told on me. I know they didn't. I told them that I wasn't missing any lessons because that was true." Timothy listened carefully. He asked Martin questions about various subjects, and Martin gave him specific examples. "I want to go home, Pa. I don't have a future here, but I do in the United States." Timothy looked Martin directly in the eye and said, "Don't ever lie to me again. Truth must be told." Martin nodded. The tears began to flow. Timothy took out his handkerchief and wiped his son's eyes. Timothy promised his son, "We will go back to Waltham. You must finish out the school year here in Athenry, and you will go to school every day and stay in school every day. Do you understand?" And Martin nodded in agreement. So that's the story. Now, of course, there's more and they did come back, as we know. There's more to what happens in Waltham. There's more to what happens in Athenry, but that is in the book. So here's my father and mother. My father married Dorothy Gannon. The Gannons lived on Galen Street in Waltham, so she's another Waltham native. Also, my father, as early as the year I was born, 1947, he was at Harvard Law at that point, and he ran for city council, and he made city council, and he served on as a Waltham city councilor at large for many, many years. He was president of city council. So, but before that, he came back to the Bright School. Then he went to North Junior. Then he went next door to St. Mary's. Then he went to Boston College, where I just have to say he was there on a football scholarship initially. And when he went out for practice and he saw the other people, the other guys who were there for the football team, they were a lot bigger than he was. He decided that he would pay tuition, which they could afford. It was like $200. And so he paid tuition and said goodbye to the football team. He was the editor of the Subtora, the yearbook, and he was valedictorian of his class. And he always said that there were a lot of smart people there, and he wasn't necessarily the smartest, but he felt that he worked harder than anyone else, and that's how he got to be valedictorian. It was 1942, World War II. He joined the Navy, went to a midshipman school in Notre Dame, and then he taught there. Then he had the commission of a sub chaser, and he saw action. And then when he came back, he went to Harvard Law and elected counselor at large, etc. And he served, he was an attorney in Waltham for many years. So that's basically what was in the book. And but what I intended to do, this is for family and friends, and there's a lot that I put in there. And what I did was I used something called Scrivener, which is an application, and if it's a writing application, and it has ways that you can outline chapters, you can develop characters. It's really an organizational tool, so you can do research, you can have pictures, and you can integrate them really easily. So I did a lot of the writing and the organizing in Scrivener, and then that moves very, very easily into Microsoft Word. And so that's what I did. And then when I thought that I was finally as ready as I could be, after having everybody in my family read it and things, I wanted to publish it myself, independent publishers. And so I started looking, and it turns out that even if you publish independently, it's quite a bit of money. But I thought, what the heck, I'll spend those thousands of dollars, and started to put some of the information in one of them. And then again, during the pandemic time, and it just didn't work. And it wasn't, like for days, I wouldn't hear back. Then I watched some videos on KDP, which is Kindle Direct Publishing, which is through Amazon. And I thought, that looks so easy, and it's not going to cost money to do it that way. And I can just get books at a very low cost, and I can do what I want with these books, my audience, family, and friends. So I did that, and it worked pretty well. I used a lot of the templates. I even used templates for the cover. And so you have 5x7s here. The 6x8 is a little bit bigger, and I fixed some of the errors. If I were to do this again, I would hire not a manuscript editor, which most people would need because I know that part, but a formatting editor would be one of the things that I would recommend. So here we go. So thanks for your attention and presence tonight. I brought some family artifacts that people can look at. Let's all keep remembering and researching our families' experiences and artifacts. Maybe you'll decide that you write your own family history novel. And now I'm ready for any questions and comments. And I really do thank all of you. You're here.